South Carolina's women's basketball team hasn't even gotten to the offseason yet, and Don Staley already has some good news regarding next year. Te-Hina Paopao is coming back.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Angeline, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. Got a lot we're going to dive into on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Gamecocks. We're going to talk about South Carolina's new wide receivers coach, Mike Furrey, and how he is going to change the complexion of the Gamecocks wide receiver room. We're also going to talk about Lamont Paris and the National Coach of the Year conversation, which appears to be shifting and focusing more so on another top head coach in the sport. Is that fair to Lamont Paris? We'll dive into that later on as well. But we're going to start off today's show with arguably the biggest news that took place on Monday, as South Carolina's women's basketball program found out that senior guard Teahina Powpow is going to return this next season. And this is a big deal for a variety of different reasons, including her skill set that she offers, what it's going to mean for the players behind her, and also how she fits into South Carolina's basketball team on the court. So let's go ahead and break down each of those facets one by one. Let's start off with Teahina Paopaw's shooting ability. It is probably the biggest reason why Paopao was brought into this program this past off season. Kind of talked about this on the Monday show. Obviously, after what happened in the Final Four this past season, Don Staley and the Gamecocks, they basically got a very rough wake-up call that they needed more perimeter shooting on this basketball team. And literally, Don Staley could not have found anyone better in that regard in the portal than Teahina Paopao. So you bring her in, and Paopao has been the best shooter on this team from behind the three-point line, probably the best in the SEC, and definitely one of the best in the entire sport. But it's not just her overall shooting percentage that is so impressive. What's also impressive about Teahina Paopaw's three-point shooting ability is the fact that she is not just a catch-and-shoot three-point shooter. She's not someone that just stands there in one spot and sort of waits for the ball to get thrown her way. She can create her own shot. She has a little bit of a step back in her game that, especially when it is paired up with a screen at the top of the key, can be quite lethal against South Carolina's opponents. The other thing that is notable about Teahina Paopaw's shot is how quickly she gets the ball out of her hands. And that is something that you cannot undersell in the sport of basketball. And when you compare this to Bree Hall and Tessa Johnson, look, especially with Tessa Johnson, I think that she's got a lot of potential to be the next sharpshooter for this team once Teahina Paopao eventually moves on from the program 2 off seasons from now. But when I look at Johnson and I look at Bree Hall right now and their shots, they don't get rid of the ball very quickly, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, again, as long as you got plenty of space. But Paopao, she can shoot the ball even if she's got a defender, say, like 5-8 feet right in front of her, while the other two, they need a touch more space to work with if they're going to get the ball out of their hands. And so, because of that, I think that puts Teahina Paopao on a different level in terms of her perimeter shooting that no one else really offers on this basketball team right now. And that's not as a slight to the others on this team. It's just that Paopao is that good of a shooter from that range. And so that's huge for South Carolina, knowing that they've got someone like that coming back for this team in the 2024-25 season. Now, another reason why this return's a big deal for the Gamecocks is that this is going to allow players behind Paopao right now. Basically, Malaysia Fulwiley and Tessa Johnson, more time to develop, assuming that they both stay. I hate to feel like I have to add that caveat in there now with the transfer portal era, but again, you never know. I would suspect both of these players will stay, but I've said that before, and I wound up being wrong, especially on the football side, so I'm not going to make any promises. But assuming that they're both back next year, I think that, look, long-term, Fulwiley and Tessa Johnson, they both have higher ceilings as overall players than Te-Hina Paopao. I truly believe that, but that does not mean that they're ready to play a significant role for this team at this very point in time. I specifically think that these two players, they still have to get better defensively. For Fulwiley, it's more so an issue of sometimes she is a bit too aggressive. And look, at times, her aggressiveness on defense, it works to her advantage. And she gets some steals on her own and basically can run coast to coast for an easy layup. But there's other times where maybe she underestimates her matchup a little bit too much, and the guard ends up blowing right past her, or at least getting hip to hip with her. And as a defender in basketball, once you are hip to hip, having to run to the basket, quite frankly, that is a disadvantageous position. At least in my opinion, it is. It opens the door for more fouls. And Fulwiley, plenty of times this season, has found herself in foul trouble in a very short time because she was in a very bad spot defensively, because quite frankly, she crept up too far on her matchup. For Tessa Johnson, it's simply trying to get a little bit quicker defensively, and she's a true freshman, so obviously that's just going to naturally come with more time in the program. But the point is, these two players, I think that their ceilings are higher, but in terms of defense, they could be better. Teahina Paopao, she's experienced, she is seasoned, she knows what she has on both ends of the floor, so she's not going to put herself in a bad position very often, and I think that that's something that you have to value. So that's another good thing. Fulwiley and Johnson, they're going to have more time to develop and mold their game in preparation for the departure of Teahina Paopao and eventually a Raven Johnson at that point guard spot. And speaking of Raven Johnson, the last point I want to bring up here, Teahina Powpow, in my opinion, as a combo guard, someone that can run the point on certain possessions, she is the perfect complement to Raven Johnson. When we talk about Raven Johnson on this team, we talk about a guard that loves to run the floor. As soon as Raven Johnson gets the ball, she wants to run to the other end. She wants to create a fast break opportunity. She's looking for her teammates. Sometimes she'll take the ball herself and just go right into the paint. Raven wants to basically create a track meet for her individual opponent and also the opposing team entirely throughout the course of the game. She is an Energizer Bunny. She seems to never run out of stamina or endurance, which is just unreal considering how much effort that she gives out there. But there are also times where, admittedly, that can be Raven Johnson's worst enemy. And again, you take the bad with the good because the good usually outweighs the bad in a lot of these games. But when South Carolina does need to slow things down, maybe they've gotten a little bit too hectic, the opponent has gotten, say, a couple of consecutive baskets, and South Carolina struggling offensively, Paopao can get the ball and she can go, okay, we need to slow things down for at least this possession because we have got to get a bucket. Let's run a set play. And so because of that, I think that it is fair to say that Teahina Paopao and Raven Johnson, they complement each other so well as a backcourt because Raven, she is going to go out there and run the floor, but Teahina knows when you need to hit the brake pedal a little bit and you got to slow things down. And I think it is a great chemistry that these two guards have because they don't get flustered when the other guard wants to play sort of their style for a particular possession when they're the one that is running down the court or walking down the court with the basketball. So, with how she fits in this backcourt, the young, talented players behind her getting more time to develop, and the skill set that she possesses, particularly when it comes to shooting the basketball behind the three-point line, having Teahina Paopao back for the 2024 through 25 season, it is a massive deal for South Carolina's women's basketball team. And to get that decision before the tournament, I think is also good because obviously Paopao, she's no longer going to have to face those questions and she won't have that hanging over her head when these games roll around. So big time for Dawn Staley and the Gamecocks knowing that their top 3-point shooter is coming back for one more season after this season is over. Now, switching gears to the men's basketball team, we're going to have to wait another day before they play their big-time game against Tennessee, but I don't want to talk about games today. I want to talk about a different conversation surrounding the most prestigious award that Lamont Paris can get individually, which is the National Coach of the Year award. For a while, it looked like Lamont Paris was a shoo-in for this award, but now there's some talk about another coach in the sport getting this award, and I think that the fact that some of these people are talking about this other coach like it's a guarantee he's going to get it is a bit disrespectful to Lamont. And I think it's important to remind people what he has done. So we're going to dive into that conversation in a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, as new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. We've got an intriguing game coming up later tonight in the NBA. The Boston Celtics are going on the road to take on the Cleveland Cavaliers. Why is this a big game? Well, the Celtics are currently in first place in the Eastern Conference. The Cavaliers are currently in third place. So this is going to play a role in playoff seeding here. This could be very much a playoff-like game. The Cavaliers are 7.5-point underdogs according to the odds makers at FanDuel. And moneyline-wise, they all very much like the Boston Celtics. Celtics are listed at minus 310. The Cavaliers are listed at plus 250. So, intriguing game to bet on here. But you could also check out some other games or player props and specialty bets. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who made the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. A few weeks ago, Lamont Paris was considered almost a guarantee by a lot of analysts and pundits in men's college basketball to be the sport's national coach of the year. Now, that narrative has suddenly shifted over the past literally 2-3 days, as UConn's Dan Hurley is now the name being thrown out there as the likely head coach of the year, based on the opinions of several pundits and analysts. And I've got a huge problem with this. Not the fact that Hurley is a name being thrown out there, but more so the fact that it's almost like no one's even considering Lamont, at least out of a certain group. CBS Sports' Gary Parrish, he put out an article on Monday proclaiming that Dan Hurley should be the national coach of the year. And then Field of 68, I watched some of their stuff from time to time, and Rob Doster, who I believe is the owner and founder of Field of 68, he's a UConn guy, so of course he said Dan Hurley should be the national coach of the year. John Fanta is another guy that is on that network and does good work. He is a Big East guy, so he also pretty much made it out like it shouldn't even be a thought. Dan Hurley is the national coach of the year. So obviously you could see where a couple of those guys have some bias when it comes to this conversation, but I think that it is important for some people nationally to remember what Lamont Paris has done here at South Carolina this season. We'll compare it somewhat to what Dan Hurley's done with UConn for this topic. Firstly, let's talk about the in-season performance relative to preseason expectations. South Carolina fans all know this by this point. The Gamecocks were picked dead last in the SEC in the preseason. They were picked to finish 14th in this conference. So the fact that this team has a chance to win at least a share of the SEC regular season title with what they do this week, that is an incredible accomplishment in and of itself. And quite frankly, I should be able to just leave it at that for why Lamont Paris should be the national coach of the year. Dan Hurley and the UConn Huskies, on the other hand, they were picked to finish third in the Big East, a highly respectable basketball conference, and they won the regular season title this past Saturday. So my point here is this. In terms of the expectation coming into this season, Lamont Paris has greatly outperformed his expectation of finishing last in a Power 6 conference and now has a shot at a regular season title. Now, a point that Rob Doster brought up on Field of 68 that I want to dive into a bit here. He talked about how, we have to be careful looking at coaches that just outperform expectations and always looking at just those coaches and basically excluding the coaches of programs that do really well record-wise at programs like UConn. And to a certain extent, I do agree with his premise there. But I think that it's important to remember, again, Dan Hurley and UConn, they were picked to finish in the top 3 in the Big East. That's not being slighted. Okay, South Carolina was picked to finish dead last. They didn't finish dead last in the SEC last year. People thought they were going to do worse this year despite what all they added in the transfer portal. That is a slight, and it was a slight. So I do think that at a certain point, with you outperforming expectations to this degree, if you're Lamont Paris, that should matter a great deal in this conversation. Now, let's look at the conference comparison here. The SEC currently has 5 top 25 teams in the AP Top 25 poll. The team that's rated the highest is Tennessee, who was 4th. The team that's rated the lowest, ironically enough, is South Carolina, who was listed as 17th. And according to ESPN's Joe Lunardi, the SEC is expected to have 7 teams in the NCAA tournament later this month. Looking at the Big East, they only have 3 teams ranked in the top 25, albeit all of these teams are top 10 teams, starting with UConn, who's ranked 2nd, and Creighton, who was the lowest ranked team at number 10. The Big East is projected to have 5 teams make the NCAA tournament, according to ESPN's Joe Lunardi. So, sure, the Big East, they got a couple more, maybe top 10 teams than the SEC does, but the SEC has more depth, in my opinion, at the very tippity top going towards the middle of the pack of the conference. And I think that that should matter a little bit when we're talking about, again, Lamont Paris and the expectation that was set on him and the fact that top to bottom, the SEC by just a little bit is better than the Big East, at least to this point this year. Now, let's talk about what these coaches had to deal with this past offseason. Dan Hurley had to replace 5 of his top 8 guys in his main rotation from his team that he had last season. Lamont Paris lost an NBA draft pick in Gigi Jackson, a veteran power forward in Hayden Brown, who was certainly reliable more often than not, and the only notable returner that he had for this year's team was Michi Johnson. And that was from a team that won 11 games last season. 11. What did Dan Hurley do with UConn last year? Dan Hurley won a national championship. So when both of these coaches went into the transfer portal and were making their pitch to these guys and telling them why they should come and join their team for next year, Dan Hurley almost didn't have to say anything probably. All he had to do was go and point at a trophy case and say, look what we did last year. You join us, I can get you a ring. Lamont Paris, sure, he's got a good reputation, a good resume as an assistant coach and a first-time head coach at Chattanooga, but in terms of being at South Carolina and what he's building here, all he could really offer was hope and you're going to play. That was really it. That was all Lamont could really guarantee and pitch to these guys. And yet, at this point in the season, the Gamecocks only have 2 less wins than the UConn Huskies. South Carolina is fighting for an SEC regular season title. Nobody thought that that was going to be the case this past October. Not a soul outside of that building. And you're sitting here and telling me that the coach that just won a national championship last year, and by the way, it should be noted, UConn is not the consensus number 1 team in the country right now. This would be a different conversation if UConn was, say, undefeated or only had 1 loss, and they were the unanimous number 1 team. If that was the case, then this conversation would probably be null and void. It would be understandable why. You would say Dan Hurley should be the national coach of the year. But they're not. Houston makes a good argument. Purdue makes a really good argument. So the fact that all of a sudden this storyline is changing to Dan Hurley should be the national coach of the year, I'm not trying to put down what Dan Hurley's done. He's done a great job with UConn. There's no question about that. But I mean, come on now. If you tell me Lamont Paris is not the national coach of the year, I don't know what you've been watching. Clearly, you're stuck in Big East country, or you just watch nothing but West Coast teams play every single Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday night. You're not paying enough attention to the Southeast down here. And maybe it's the fact that these people almost feel like that they have to give Dan Hurley the National Coach of the Year award because of what he did last year. I don't think he won any major awards last year, but of course they went on their run in the NCAA tournament and won the national title quite handedly for the most part. So maybe it's almost like we got to include last year, and that's why some of these people are saying this. But I just find it funny that in just a couple weeks' time, it went from Lamont should be National Coach of the Year, and now all of a sudden, it's just all Dan Hurley for certain people. Not everybody, but a couple people in the national media space. So, Lamont Paris, he should still be the National Coach of the Year. Anybody that disagrees with that, go talk to a wall. That's how I feel about that. Now, South Carolina's football program, they introduced a new wide receivers coach for the second time this offseason this past Friday. Shane Beamer certainly made some interesting conversation in that regard amongst other SEC fan bases, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the wide receivers coach that he hired, Mike Furrey, and I'm going to tell y'all why this man is going to change the culture of that wide receiver room. I'll explain all that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. Starting off with the 2024 Nissan Rogue, which is perfect for city drives and great escapes. It's also got a class-exclusive Google built-in that is always your updating assistant that can call on almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. You can also look at the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder, which can fit up to 8 people and possesses an expansive cargo capacity and advanced available 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. South Carolina has a new wide receivers coach in Mike Furrey. He was formerly the head coach over at Limestone, and he's also coached in the NFL for several years and played at a pretty decent level at the NFL ranks. So Mike Furrey, he has definitely been through a lot already in his football career, being a sitting head coach at the college level and being a wide receiver that played alongside a Calvin Johnson, a future Hall of Fame wideout for the Detroit Lions several years back during his playing days. But Mike Furrey, as a wide receivers coach at South Carolina, I think that he is going to be a bit of a culture shock for some of the guys in that room and the guys that will be coming into that room during future seasons. And I think that that is going to be a good thing. So before I really get into this, I want to play a clip and sound bite for all of you where Mike Furrey lays out the expectations for his wide receiver room. I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to be about 2.5 minutes, so bear with me. I did not feel like, though, I should cut out any of this because of just how good all of this stuff was. So take a listen to what Mike Furrey had to say with this question.
What can players expect a Mike Furrey wide receiver room to look like?
Well, I think it's there's 3 things that I've built myself, and I think it's what's called a method. And I've carried this with me my whole entire life. And the first thing of that method, to me, if you can create the method, that creates success, right? And I think the first thing that it's guaranteed is effort. I think when you go out there and you watch us run around, it's not going to be shy of effort. It's not going to be shy of exhausting ourselves for a better purpose, and that's our team. And we'll practice like that. We'll play like that. We'll run routes like that. There will always be a purpose, but it's going to be a maximum effort that's going to be behind that. And that's in everything that we do. Again, going back to the question about development, some of the greatest ones I've ever been around, they give max effort in walkthroughs. Right now, I know the tone of things, and I know how you slow stuff down, and I know how to go crazy on things. But when you have maximum effort, when you give effort, that means it's important, right? That you're telling somebody it's important to you. And so you're trying to make sure that you can maximize that. And so I'll talk to our guys all the time about giving 110%, right? More than the normal. Become rare, right? And then goal-oriented, okay? And I call that level up. We'll talk about leveling up every day. I talk to our guys about just making sure that we have goals that we want to reach. Goals for now, goals for the team, individual goals, and how do we get there? And to me, when you become goal-oriented, well, then that's going to make sure you're locked in on your goal, which to me now becomes your discipline. Your discipline in your route running, your discipline in your studies, your discipline in your academics, your discipline anytime that whatever it is, anytime that we take the field. And again, I think through all those things, what evolves then is a great teammate. And I think when you become a great teammate, then you become a great group. And when you become a great group, now you become pretty lethal. And I think all those things hit really well. They're very self-explanatory. They're easy to manage every single day. But I just don't think you live any different. And I think if you do live any different, then I think you're wasting what the good Lord's blessed you with. And if you're going to waste that, then I'm going to get after you. And like Coach Beamer said, just like coaching, if that's not for you and this isn't for you, and if this is not how you want to live and this is not how you want to pursue the best that you can become for your team, well, this might not be the best place, right? But that's how you got to find out. Rather than putting hope out on the field, you're going to put a product. And that product's going to be daggone stinking good, and they're going to freaking run around like a bunch of banshees and play ball.
How could you not love that as a fan? I mean, really, how could you not love that? Now, let me get back to my point about a culture shock and it being a positive culture shock. This is not meant as a way to degrade Justin Stepp. I know that some of y'all still disagree with the fact Justin Stepp is gone. I fully understand that, and we can all have our own opinions on that. Here's what I will say, though. I firmly believe that during Justin Stepp's time at South Carolina, he did not always get the best out of his wide receivers. I think you could say Josh Vann was a good development job by him, along with Jalen Brooks. I don't give him credit for Antoine Juice Wells, and I don't give him credit fully for Xavier Legette. Mike Furrey is a coach that it is going to be, him coaching his guys is going to be the equivalent of a guy that pushes you towards the edge of a cliff and sees how far he can push you before you really start to get nervous and before you really start to change in terms of how you respond. That is how he is going to coach these wide receivers. You can tell by the way that Mike Furrey talks. He is obviously a consummate professional as a coach. He believes in a lot of little things, and clearly it is stuff that he has lived by his entire life, and that's how he has gotten to this point, and that is how he is going to train and coach these wide receivers. And I'm going to just say it. Some of these guys maybe have been on this roster for a couple of years and maybe are still here. When Mike Furrey rolls around in spring practice, they're probably going to find out real quickly they might not like his coaching style. His coaching style to me comes off as a little bit old school. He's going to, like he said, he'll get after you. He's not going to let you just loaf around and basically waste what you've got as a football player. And if you're not willing to push yourself and level up your game, like he said, then you might have to just go elsewhere. I think that's the kind of attitude, quite frankly, that this football team needs right now. After having a 5-7 season in 2023, especially with a position group like wide receiver that, let's be honest again, behind Xavier Legette, was really not that good last year. Let's just go ahead and say it, was very unimpressed with that wide receiver room behind Legette. You needed a Mike Furrey in there. That room needs an attitude adjustment to a certain degree, I think, and they're going to get that with Mike Furrey. In terms of recruiting, look, some people might worry about that kind of stuff. In my opinion, with Mike Furrey, he is a guy that if he develops players, eventually he'll be able to recruit for himself in that regard. I can see Mike Furrey being the kind of coach where he gets a 3-star that maybe in the past couple of years would have not developed very much. But with Mike Furrey being there, he finds a way to unlock certain things. And again, It doesn't seem like that he has a very complex formula for how to do that. He might have his own wide receiver specific drills that he likes to run in practice and all that we'll never know about. But it seems like it all comes down to you got to put in the work. I can only imagine how good Xavier Legette could have been if Mike Furrey was his head coach, his wide receivers coach the entire time he was here. I don't think it would have taken until Xavier Legette's 5th season for him to finally break out. I don't think it would have taken that long. Obviously, can't prove that, but all I'm saying is this. I think that Mike Furrey was a good hire by Shane Beamer. I'm not going to go so far as to say it was the absolute best hire he could have made. We'll, of course, find out if that is the truth or not in the next season or two. But I think that with Mike Furrey now being in this program, the offense, again, you talk about Sean Elliott being hired. You talk about Marquell Blackwell being the new running backs coach. Those are 2 ball coaches right there. And we obviously know the kind of energy Sean Elliott's going to bring every day in practice. Now you throw in a Mike Furrey, a guy that, again, tons of NFL experience, walks and talks like that. That offense, listen, they might have some work to do this next season. It might not always be pretty, but doggone it, I don't think that they're going to have any issue with the effort that those guys play with, whether they are starters or whether they are backups. I think you're going to see an offense that is going to put their nose to the grindstone, and they're going to get after you. They're not going to win every battle, but they're going to make you have to earn it. And I think that, again, this football program needed a little bit of that after what happened last season. Sometimes you got to have some guys that just go in there and just tell you what exactly the situation is and pretty much just say, things are going to be different in this room. You can either join me or, again, this program might not be suited for you anymore. So, be very interesting to see how Mike Furrey operates with his wide receivers in practice, in a practice setting when spring practice gets underway later this month. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on Te-Hina Paopao returning for this next season? What do you think it means for this women's basketball team? What are your thoughts on the National Coach of the Year conversation shifting away from Lamont Paris to a guy like a Dan Hurley from UConn? And do you think that that's a bit unfair considering what Lamont Paris still has out in front of him right now? And lastly, what are your opinions on Mike Furrey, the new wide receivers coach at South Carolina? How do you think he is going to affect that room? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you could shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.